Hello and welcome. I'm Nozi Poshabalala. As world leaders discuss climate change at COP26 in Glasgow, in this conversation, we are going to be exploring the need for accurate and clear communication about climate change. We're also going to be looking at what research is telling us about the public's understanding about the crisis and why the crisis even matters. In addition to this, in this conversation, we're going to be taking a look at some of the proactive measures that Facebook is taking to offer centralized and authoritative information to really keep the public better informed. So thank you so much for making the time to join us. Now, joining me in the conversation is Vincent Gonge. He is the Director of Product Management for Climate at Facebook. So it's a big welcome to you, Vincent. We're also joined by Valerie Messon-Delmont. She is the co-chair of the working group at the IPCC. That, of course, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the United Nations. And we're also joined by Professor Peter Thorne. He is a climatologist and professor at Maynooth University in Ireland. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And thank you who is watching for joining us in the conversation. I want to maybe get straight into it. And Valerie, I'm perhaps going to take us back to the basics and come to you first. What do we know today about the way people approach their understanding of climate science?
What I can stress is that with the last report we've released last August, with a science that is clear, including where we are and why every increment of warming matters and what it takes to limit warming, there's an increasing curiosity, an increasing wish to understand by many people, wherever they live, whoever they are. And our report is also clear that the media coverage of scientific reports is critical to help people understand where the science is, how the science is received by the public. It's also clear that social networks play a critical role so that they support a dialogue and they support an approach to fact-based information. I still see a need to make rigorous information more easily accessible. And one example is the following. We've released an interactive atlas. In the first month, there were 500 people connecting to that atlas, making their own maps, accessing the data from every single country. It really shows the huge interest to access scientific information at the source.
Valerie, I think that's really interesting. So an uptick in curiosity, a desire to understand, and we're seeing the response from a range of media platforms and social media platforms trying to rise to that. But Peter, we know that communication is a two-way street at the very least. As a scientist, what is turning out to be the most challenging aspect of communicating ideas about climate change?
Well, the issue with climate change is that it's inherently a very, very complicated problem, but at the same time, it's a very simple problem. So there's a lot of intricacies within climate science, within understanding climate science, and the recent IPCC report, where I made a full assessment of that. But at heart, there are very simple things, that the climate is changing and changing rapidly, that it's changing due to us, and that the future that we bequeath to ourselves, but more importantly to future generations, matters to us. So at the same time, it's both massively complicated and a deluge of detailed information, but the fundamentals are really, really simple. It's changing, it's us, and the future is fundamentally our call. So it's cutting through and making clear consistently that central message. And that central message has been known for 2, 3, 4 decades. And that's what we need to stress.
Peter, I think it's a really helpful insight that you're sharing with us to say, on the one hand, we are seeing a very complex subject playing itself out, but there is an opportunity, for what I'm hearing, for us to really reduce this to the very fundamentals and go back to the simplicity of the core messaging. And now, Vincent, let me come to you, because I know that Facebook is one of those platforms that is rising to the challenge. And one would assume, though, that any discussions around climate change often assume some level of scientific knowledge about the issues, Vincent, or even about the challenges. And so we know that Facebook has gone about really trying to conduct research into the public's understanding and opinions around climate change. I think what the audience and I are really interested in is, firstly, tell us a little bit about the research, but also tell us, what did you discover?
Yes, so we're curious about getting a detailed pulse on all those questions. So earlier this year, in partnership with the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication, we launched a climate change opinion survey in over 30 countries to ask people about their views on climate change. And so we really wanted to understand public attitudes, knowledge, behaviors, policy preferences, and how they vary across the world. So the first thing that we found is that more than 60% of people across all countries and territories that we surveyed want more information about climate change. So to Valerie's point, there is kind of this need that is expressed by people, and it varies across countries. So for example, in the Philippines, I think that was the highest, with over 83% of people declaring they want at least some more, if not a lot more information. The other thing that was clear is that people want to see their governments prioritizing climate change and doing more to address it. For example, in Latin America, across Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, that's where people were most likely to say that climate change should be a very high priority for the government. And then in terms of getting to maybe what we can do about it, or where are people's kind of state of mind when it comes to the climate, if you kind of look at three buckets, one is the causes of climate change, the impacts of climate change, and then what people are like the world can do about climate change. In the first bucket of causes, we've seen that there's an overwhelming majority, over 3/4 of people, who believe that climate change is happening, but there's slightly less people who understand that it's caused by human activities. So there's still some work to do there in terms of education. In terms of impacts, what's interesting there is that a lot of people understand that climate change is going to harm future generations, but there is a lesser understanding that climate change is causing harm for communities now. And so in terms of health impacts, in terms of kind of day-to-day natural disasters, et cetera, there's kind of this lack of understanding. And it then gets into the actions and solutions where there's lots of people with good intentions to address climate change and kind of more broadly the environment. So actions like recycling and reducing plastic use are top of mind for people. But in terms of the broader range of solutions for climate change, the mental model is kind of all over the place. So there is a good amount of work to do to provide clarity in terms of what are the solutions at every level of society.
Vincent, I think you've set the stage for me to work my way back to Peter, because Peter said, look, we have an opportunity to go back to the fundamentals and to focus on the core messaging. Now, Peter, I'm interested in the community, the quarter or so part of the population that looks at the causes and doesn't identify with the human aspect. I'm interested in the part of the population that is disconnected from understanding that we're doing harm right now today, that Vincent speaks about, the part of the population whose mental model doesn't allow them to go back beyond sort of the personalized recycling, small activities, and make those connections to the big picture. The question I want to bring to you, Prof, is what ways have you learned that we could perhaps tap into right now to share the complicated science around climate change so that we can shift the mindsets and the perceptions and the attitudes of these populations?
So that's a really interesting and challenging question, because a lot of these people are hard to reach, and it comes into the echo chambers that we are increasingly living in, where you listen to the people that you want to listen to. Experience that I had nationally in Ireland, that Valerie could also talk to, is the Citizens' Assembly. And this was where we got 100 citizens in. We removed their phones and their computers. We got them to sit down for 2 weekends together both listening to experts, but then talking to each other. And these were representative samples of the population. And it's amazing when you give those representative samples of the population the time and the information, how you see the transformation. Now, clearly, we can't sit down people 100 at a time and do this. It would take forever, and it wouldn't work necessarily as well. But it does highlight that a lot of this is an information deficit and an echo chamber issue that we need to somehow break down. This is a problem facing all of humanity, and we need to work out ways that we can reach out to everyone, make sure they get good information, and also allow them to discuss not only with their personal echo chamber, but to reach out to other sectors of society to really work through this problem and work out what the solutions that are acceptable to all are.
Valerie, I think the next question is I want to build on the equation that I think Peter is giving us. Peter's saying to us, talking plus listening plus time plus information plus courage. And I'm putting in courage because it's the courage to break out of those individual echo chambers. Taking that as a baseline equation, what more could educators and scientists do to do a better job of communicating about climate science?
I think there's one dimension we have not yet touched. It's also about understanding why it matters where we live. So it's also a crucial aspect of providing actionable climate information in every region. And for instance, the science is clear that climate change is already affecting every region. Trends, extremes, more intense, more frequent, and sometimes with a possibility for an event a community has experienced to provide the understanding of why, our emissions of heat-trapping gases have made that event more likely, more intense. We've seen the impacts. We've taken lessons about, we're not prepared for today's climate, and that event will further change with any further increment of warming. So that information is really important to be prepared, to anticipate, not to run behind the changing climate, but to take action, to take ownership of the information that is available and to act on the cause. And that process really needs to be anchored within each community. It can be done with professional lives. It can be done in a personal life, in a city, for instance. But I agree that it's really important to create the conditions for a dialogue and allow some time. And there are couples of really bright examples where, in some cases, people have translated that scientific knowledge into a couple of cards. And then you can create a discussion around these cards within 3 hours. You can have a couple of tens of people doing that process. And it creates really ownership. It creates engagement, the wish to explain to others what you have learned. And that's a very powerful process. And that example I'm mentioning has touched 1 million people in France. It's translated in 25 different languages. And it's very cheap. It's really easy to implement. But I really echo to what was said previously. It's really about avoiding, the filter bubbles and creating the conditions for a dialogue based on the facts that can be shared.
Valerie, I think you've added such an important variable, and I want to quickly test it with Peter once again, and that's the variable of context. You're saying it's important for us to connect with the significance of where we live. And I'm sitting in Johannesburg as we're having this conversation, and it's not lost on me that one of the biggest narratives in Africa, despite being one of the most vulnerable regions, one of the most exposed regions, that, Valerie, we're perhaps not ahead of the curve. We're not anticipating, we're not prepared as much as we could be. So Peter, maybe I'd love to just hear your quick comment on the significance of that contextualized understanding.
It's absolutely key that we have contextualized understanding. We'll only have meaningful climate action, both mitigation and adaptation, if we make climate change inherently personal to people. It's got to be inside your bubble, not outside your bubble. If it's inside your bubble, it matters to you. If it matters to you, you will take action. We're very good at filtering out things that doesn't affect me, and therefore I don't need to do anything about it. So we need to make climate inherently part of the conversation on a sustained basis. So many of the stories that we hear have a climate context, and yet so rarely is that climate context given. So we do not have that sustained conversation in which climate is an inherent part of it, which makes climate and climate solutions part of what will be everyday life. Because the only way we're going to get to meaningful climate action is to have climate be part of your day-to-day decision making.
Sure, I'm really loving the insights that are coming and bubbling to the surface, this idea of sustained conversation integrated into the normal order of things. Vincent, I've been watching your face and you've been nodding as Valerie and Peter have speaking. So I'm keen to hear if there's anything that's really resonating with you that you'd like to comment on. But also in addition to that, Vincent, let's talk a little bit about the Center for Climate Science. What is its goal? And let's talk a little bit about the process of setting it up. What is the rationale behind the need for this particular center?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can answer both questions at the same time, because it's the way we build the Climate Science Center is with those kind of discussions that we've had in mind. So the research findings I mentioned actually kind of were published after we launched the Climate Science Center. But really the goal for the Climate Science Center is to inform people on the key facts about climate change, and then make climate science and solutions more accessible to people. And I'll talk a little bit about how we think about achieving that. And then we want to make sure that as they learn more and take action, we can kind of continue to scale that across communities. And so what we've done is at the start is to work with a set of organizations. We're lucky to have the IPCC, the UNEP, and more than 200 organizations that we worked with to start with the facts, to start with the key messages, to start with the science. But then obviously it doesn't stop there. We have to then take the science that is kind of global in essence and make it accessible to people. And so the way we think about that is kind of three aspects. We need to meet people where they are. We need to make this information engaging. And then we need to make it kind of localized or kind of specific to people's communities. So thinking about meeting people where they are, what we've done is creating those informational labels, which, when people are exploring content that is about climate change, we provide a way to kind of link to the Climate Science Center so that people can see more. And that kind of links to a bunch of tests that we've done in terms of understanding what is the best way to engage people into learning more when they see content about climate change. And the best candidate that we've actually decided to use as our key message is see how the temperature is changing in your community. And so this is a unit that we've designed with WRI, where we provide people with access to how temperature has changed in their area for the past decades. So this is one of the ways where we can meet people where they are and engage them in a way that is relevant. Another aspect of engagement is quizzes and educational materials. I was very surprised to see when we launched the quizzes earlier this year how engaging it was to people. And so that's, I think, more of those things that we're going to need to do. And finally, we need to expand this information to various countries of the world. Over the next few weeks, we're going to expand it to over 100 countries that cover over 1 billion people. But we know that as we do this, we will need to make that information localized to every single country of the world, which is hard. And then even once you're there, within each country, there's a lot of diversity. And so that's why we're really getting started on this journey.
I think those are really some practical examples of what the center is doing and the impact that it's having. And of course, Vincent, as you talk about the ambition to reach 1 billion people, I'm going to come to you a bit later just to talk about, how much you be leveraging your user base to do that, because one assumes that could create a bridge and an enabler. But before we move on, Vincent, I just wanted to just quickly circle back to some similar initiatives that Facebook has done. I know some successes around COVID-19, and one would, take from science, of course, that, when we have evidence-based success, it gives us the confidence to replicate and scale. Maybe just a quick comment from you on that as well, Vincent.
Of course, yes. So similarly to the Climate Science Center, last year we launched a COVID Information Center, which also we've seen was one of the best ways for Facebook to utilize its reach to help reach billions of people with accurate, reliable information about COVID, and kind of with a similar playbook of thinking about the causes, the impacts, and the solutions. There are a few differences, though, I think, with climate, that the volume of conversations, kind of the baseline level of conversations that's happening, is much, much higher for COVID than for climate. So I think there's work to do for society in general to talk more about climate change. I think Peter was mentioning that that's one of the key differences. The other key difference is the complexity of the impact and solutions. If you think about COVID, the solutions are kind of universal for society, but when we think about climate, there's way more than a handful of solutions. Various communities, depending on socioeconomics, like a lot of the things that people can do or governments can do is going to vary. And so I think the task is very complex when it comes to climate change, but we can definitely learn from the playbook that we've applied for COVID, which is taking the solutions and really at scale informing people and encouraging them to take action.
That's fantastic. I love the phrase that we have the opportunity to learn from the playbook that was developed in response to COVID-19, because that's always the opportunity. But I suppose, Valerie, public policymakers don't always have a playbook, and maybe they should. And so maybe the question that I want to bring to you is, why is it important for policymakers to have an intricate understanding of the level of understanding that the public has about climate change?
Well, what was striking for me was the fact that the example of citizen assemblies mentioned by Peter, when you take people, randomly selected to reflect the diversity of the population of a country, there was the experience in Ireland, in the UK, in France, and in other countries. And when you do that, it's really impressive how people, after a couple of weekends, have an in-depth ownership of the challenges, are willing to act, and then do not understand why decision makers do not act. And then when I present the IPCC reports to audiences of decision makers, what I realize is that, well, in fact, they have not got that training. They didn't have a course or a training session on what is climate change, why it matters for a specific country, what's the latest knowledge, how does the action in a specific region compares to another one. And there's a challenge, because then you may face a gap between those who have been through that understanding process, citizens from citizen assemblies, but also young people around the world, because they get access to that knowledge through education, through university training more and more. And we are facing the challenge that there may be a growing gap between the understanding of the urgency to act by the younger generations, for instance, and the state of knowledge and willingness to act by those who actually have the possibility to act quickly now. And just to get back to what was said by Vincent previously, in terms of important information, I think what's the value of all these initiatives is to make visible what people cannot see. So we're talking about, pandemic statistics. It's important to help people visualize that, have access to that, understand what's at play. For climate change, it's about, the characteristics of a changing climate, not just warming trends, but also extreme events that are changing in frequency, in intensity, affecting new regions. Why it's changing, the role of human influence compared to natural variability. People are really keen to better understand what we know on that. And then also provide information on trends in greenhouse gas emissions. It's invisible in your daily life. So helping people understand what's happening where they live in their country, for a specific company, for their own footprint, I think there's really the possibility to do much more than what is done now, so that discussions can be informed by factual information as much as possible.
Valerie, I just want to follow up on something, because I think you've said something really powerful, and I almost heard it as a caution to say, if public policymakers don't take the time to really understand, to do some of the things that Vincent was talking about, to meet people where they are, to engage them, to localize the conversation, the gap between those that are expecting action and those who have the power to take the action begins to grow. How do we create meaningful bridges, especially with the energy of young people? How do we pull them into the conversation so that their activism and their energy is actually part of the solution?
In my view, one opportunity is when there are policy discussions, for instance, in democratic countries before elections, to give them a voice, to give them the opportunity to challenge, to question candidates, so that they can explain what are their strategies, where they would like to go. And then having the facts in that policy discussion is really important. So that's one unique opportunity, I think, in democratic lives, and give more space to the young voices, of course.
We need to create more conversational space and be more deliberate about pulling people in. Vincent, I maybe want to circle back to you before I come to Peter, because you mentioned that aspiration of hitting, of connecting with 1 billion people. And I want to maybe just pause and look at the capacity of Facebook right now with 3 billion users. What is Facebook's role in leveraging its reach and connecting people to the local conversation? And one of the things that Valerie said that really resonated with me is that importance of ownership. And I would imagine that that local approach really embeds that sense of ownership of the conversation.
Yeah, so what I would say, I mean, before we get using our platform, is our first and foremost responsibility is in reducing our carbon footprint as a company. So we've started with our net zero program by 2030. So that is kind of the baseline of our environmental footprint being carbon neutral. But then it's really informing people at scale, and in order to do that, meeting people where they are with engaging content, and kind of the aspect of local communities is probably one of the key tools for that. So we can reach, a potential of billions of people, but if we don't crack the equation to make the conversation engaging and natural, we won't be successful. And so some of the ways to think about is thinking in local communities. Maybe another part of the invisible kind of impacts of climate change is about health. I think some of the impacts on air pollution, and the benefits of electrification, for example. I think some of the benefits that we could provide to create that conversation within communities and spur action. And then there are sets of groups that already exist on the platform. One that is maybe tangential to climate change is an example in France, in my home country, of the Run Eco team, which has over 27,000 members. And this is a community of people who just go on runs and collect trash on the road and then share this with each other and encourage to do more. So how can we do the same thing, but for the challenges of climate change, for electrification at scale, for regeneration of nature at scale? And so I think there's a big role we can play there with the power of communities. And then the last thing I would say, you mentioned young activists and really encouraging them to, or like offering them tools to spur those conversations in a way that scales. And so, young activists are creators, and creators and the creator economy is one of the priorities for us as a company. And so providing more ways for people to express themselves and spread their message is definitely one of the most important ways we can help.
It's exciting times ahead, Vincent. Unleashing the power of communities and unleashing the creative power of young activists certainly sounds that we are moving in the right direction. Perhaps, Peter, as we begin to wrap up the conversation, one of the things that we wanted to tap into the conversation, of course, is to talk about authoritative sources. what are the hallmarks of authoritative sources when it comes to information about climate change on the internet, Peter?
Well, the ultimate authoritative source, of course, is the IPCC, of which Valerie is co-chair of Working Group 1. And that gets its authority fundamentally from the process. It's signed on by all of the countries in the world, and it is a very, very onerous process involving rounds of reviews by both experts and governments, and then every word in the summary for policymakers is signed off word by all of the governments in the room at the approval session. So that's the ultimate authoritative source. If you want to get the latest science, go to the IPCC, but it is very dense for a large number of people. And there are many other sources of information that perhaps bring that down. There are national assessment activities in a large number of countries which localize the information and provide it in a culturally appropriate context. And then there are a large number of reputable sources out there. Also, as we touched on earlier, it's not just new media. Old media are increasingly coming to the party in terms of climate communication. Since the publication of the Sixth Assessment Report in August, I've been giving seminars at a number of Irish national media outlets, our national broadcaster, a couple of our national newspapers, to bring them up to speed and to have discussions. And they're asking the right questions. They're asking, how do we embed this in the conversation? How do we bring it through in the stories? But equally, ultimately, there's another piece to the jigsaw here that needs to be done by governments. Climate needs to be in the heart of policy making. So government needs to have climate across government. It's not a department within the government fighting all the other departments. It needs independent advisory bodies that can provide the information context to the government. And it ideally needs an independent parliamentary, in a democracy at least, parliamentary body that can hold the government to account. The way we make climate, mainstream climate, is to start treating carbon emissions and other emissions like we treat monetary transactions. And the IPCC makes very, very clear that we need immediate, sustained, and deep reductions in greenhouse gases if we are to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. We need governments to take that seriously.
Some really good calls to action there, Peter, but all of government, all of society, because that's how we hold each other accountable. Now, as we close off, I'm not going to miss the opportunity to close off this conversation in a fun way, I hope. So, given the opportunity to address the world leaders at COP26, and all you had to do was to say to them, this is the one thing you have to unlearn about how we have been communicating about the climate crisis. What is the one thing that you would invite world leaders to unlearn about the way they've been communicating? That's the way we're going to close it off. Vincent's got his thinking face on. I just saw him looking out through the window. So Valerie, I'm going to come to you first. What's the one thing that you said, we need to unlearn this if we're going to make any progress?
I really think that there's often the wrong idea that we can wait and then we can act faster. And the science is clear. The more we emit carbon dioxide, the warmer it's going to get, with irreversible, long-lasting consequences. So I think forgetting about delaying action is critical.
I love that. We can't wait. So if there was a slogan that you'd be taking to COP26, it's we can't wait. I think Peter might have an unfair advantage here when we're talking about learning and unlearning in his professor capacity. So Vincent, I'm going to come to you next and I'll let Peter go last. What's the one thing that you think world leaders need to unlearn, Vincent?
I think it's really about ensuring that we provide clarity of solutions. And it doesn't have to be one solution. I think everyone is trying to maybe look for the one solution, but we need to provide clarity to individuals on what are the most important things to do. And I think there is not that consensus on the path to get there. And so unlearning too many debates on what is the path, I think would be very, very helpful also for us to help, spread that message then in a way that is clear and consistent.
Sure, that's really, really powerful. So we need to unlearn our practice of having too many debates about trying to find the one silver bullet and rather focus on shedding light on the multiple pathways that we can get towards the solution. Peter, you get to take us home today. What's the one thing that the world leaders need to unlearn as they go to Glasgow?
Well, to my mind, the one thing they need to unlearn is the costs of action, or put another way, they need to learn that the costs of action are going to be dwarfed by the costs of inaction. It is very hard because governments' costs are tangible, costs are things that they know. The benefits rely upon these counterfactual worlds, the worlds that will be avoided. But we know, and there is a huge wealth of knowledge out there, that not acting in the long term has a huge cost implication compared to the costs of action now. So we need to unlearn, if you like, that costs of action are the only thing that matter.
I don't think I could have put it any better. We need to unlearn that the cost of action, the cost of inaction, or we need to unlearn the cost of action in order to learn and appreciate the cost of inaction. Prof, how did I do?
Pretty good.
It's a pass. It's a pass. So it's a massive thank you to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. The conversation has been really robust and insightful and has really brought to the surface some really interesting insights. Now, we've heard a lot about how we can ensure that we are driving accurate information about climate change that is readily accessible, that meets people where they're at, that is localized and contextualized, that is engaging, and that is communicated in clear language. At this point, I just want to say a massive thank you to Vincent Gonge. He is, of course, the Director of Product Management for Climate at Facebook. I want to say a massive thank you to Valerie Messon-Delmont. She is, of course, co-chair of Group IPCC, and, of course, Professor Peter Thorne, climatologist at Maynooth University. Thank you all for your insights and for your fascinating topics and tools that you left us with today. To everybody who's tuned in and watching, thank you so much for making the time to join us. From myself, Nozipho Shabalala, it's goodbye.